Poe made his. I have read him every day, and every day he grows greater. Today I find him colossal, and if it is not he, it is at least his kind. Greetings, Poe fans, and welcome back to our degree episode on Jeanie.
Surrealism.
Surrealism.
We are so surreal. It's not
Yes.
even, it's an ism.
Are we here?
Are we not?
Yes. Are we in a dream within a dream?
I don't
Since we
know. I
have the
ask
same
myself that
man.
daily.
Yeah, since we have the same man behind us.
Yeah, which dream are we in or which reality we may be in? Who knows? Just like I was telling you at the very beginning, he's got the same expression like on his face, but
Yes.
he looks so much older in my picture than he does in yours. So it's like you're the past and I'm the future. So it's like, woo,
Yeah. And
we're
what?
in our own surreal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So tonight we're going to talk about Paul Valery.
Yes, Valery, as you can see the name that's behind me.
Yes.
Yes, he is.
I
What?
decided to get a picture without his name. I think there was one I found that had a quote. It was a different quote than what you had. But
Yes. I like this one because the wind is rising. We must attempt to live.
yeah.
I was like, that's pretty much a good quote in my opinion.
Well,
My daily life right now.
it's very fitting with our weather too.
Oh yeah, the wind is definitely rising.
Absolutely.
Can you
Well,
believe it was 5 years since the tornado tore through here? So the wind really was rising.
oh, that's true. Yeah,
Hmm.
let's not digress on that because that was very
Yeah, yeah,
very
traumatic.
yes. So back to Paul.
Yes, Paul.
So he was born October 30th, 1871.
Yeah, so
And
he was older. He was past the life of Poe, so that should tell you
absolutely.
something that he quotes Poe or pop followed Poe.
Absolutely, especially in the quote that I just read was one of his saying or statements that in something that he wrote. And he was very much a follower of Poe for reasons that I think our viewers and our listeners will be surprised. It was a different spin than I expected in researching him.
True, and the irony of this is because he was born in 1871 and he was born in a Western Mediterranean village of Sète, France. So
Yes.
he's a Frenchman,
Yep.
and how much Poe loved to write about the French, especially our wonderful Auguste Dupin.
Exactly. Exactly.
So this was very much an attraction, I
Hmm.
thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was known as the last French symbolist,
Hmm.
and he was the first post symbolist, as well
Just,
as a master in classical prosodism.
yeah,
Thought was,
Procedus, yes.
and I thought that was very interesting. Do you want to speak
Oh,
to
and
that?
also an advocate of logical positivism,
Yes, yes, and that was the other thing I was going to mention. Jeannie,
yeah, which is really odd. Okay.
yeah, do you want to speak to that for a minute?
Well, I mean, think about it. You think about post symbolism and symbolism in itself because it's all about interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
The intent and how someone sees it because Duh, don't hold me to this because it's been a while. But Picasso, if I remember, Picasso used his expressionism, his symbolic, to
Mm-hmm.
tell stories.
Right.
So, and it was it was metaphorical in its way, but it was
Yeah.
also very surreal.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. The cubism that he did.
yes. But Valery, he was very much a positive look. He was like more forward thinking, is the way I interpreted it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, about how he thought about poetry, uh, writing in general, which it's very nice that he did that because he was very much rejected the cult of poetry, which is, I love
Oh,
that use of the time.
yeah.
He was rejecting the cult of poetry. And you don't think about it, but honestly, that is just amazing. Poetry people were cults, in my opinion, because everybody had to write a certain way, they had to do a
Right.
certain thing,
Yeah.
yada, yada, yada. And
Mhm.
he didn't like that.
Yeah.
And
And
I agreed with that.
he also, with the what he thought about poetry specifically, he was not a proponent of the subject of poetry.
Right.
So, like the content, it was more about the words. And to me, I kind of took it as kind of more of technical, more logical, which we'll talk about that in a minute. And when you think about it, Poe was both of those things. He had the technical side of it. He was brilliant at the technical side, but his creativity and the subject and the content that he wrote about was beautiful.
Yes, he definitely told stories, whether it was with his
Mhm.
short stories or his poetry.
Right.
He was the storyteller the whole way, but he also was a technical genius in some ways, especially if you think about the Raven.
Oh, oh my gosh, I know.
The Raven to me, and I know Poe was not a big fan of Shakespeare,
Hmm.
but if you take the speech from Hamlet, to be or not to be, that whole soliloquy
Yeah.
that he did in that poem or in that play, sorry, in that play,
Yes.
in that play was the equivalent of the Raven to me. If
Okay.
you stuck the Raven in a play, it would be the to be or not to be as Hamlet. Because
Okay.
think about it, Hamlet was talking kind of to the ghosts, to
Yeah.
himself, to
Yeah.
everything. And so the Raven, you had the narrator talking to death, or the metaphor of the Raven being the harbinger of death, or
Right.
a ghost of Lenore.
Yeah. Or yeah,
So,
with himself. Yeah. That's a
but
really good analogy.
yeah, I mean that's always every time I think about the Raven, I automatically think of Hamlet.
Yeah.
And then Valery, he was all about saying the technical side, the logistics of it.
Yeah.
And I think he would have loved to know and he did, with Poe being a scientific logician. Log,
Just
legit,
oh Lord,
oh,
you're gonna get me tongue tied.
it's like statistician, but legit. Okay, anyway,
He
he's a
liked logic.
scientific genius. Yeah, a scientific genius. He was the Vulcan before Vulcan. Uh,
Yes.
so I think that's why Valari. Oh no, we weren't going to call him Valari,
Yeah.
right?
Let's not
Valerie.
we're
Yeah,
not
it's
going the Dean
Valerie.
Martin route. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's why Valerie loved Poe so much, because he was that logical minded genius of the
Yeah.
storyteller.
Absolutely. And he also thought that poetry was pretty much like a byproduct of the human mind's thoughts. And
Mhm.
so again, that's bringing in that surrealistic. I'm getting tongue-tied, Jeannie. It's your
I know. And it's this subject matter. That's what it is
yeah,
all
look,
these words, they're all
yeah.
coming
So
together.
that's where that surrealistic element comes in, because when you think about logic, you think about poetry, generally speaking, they don't necessarily have to marry each other. But in his mind, I think that's where he felt Poe was.
Yeah. And that's another thing that Valerie was very much, he liked the obscure.
Yes.
He was more of a metaphysical type of compilations.
Hmm.
And that's why the scientific speculation is how he preferred to label his metaphysical writing and that of others. And
Exactly.
that was the other fascination that brought him to Poe.
Absolutely. And
Because
yeah,
Julian Simmons, is it Simmons or Simons?
uh,
Simmons? It's S-Y, so I guess it could be either way, Simons or
It's
Simmons.
probably Simon's, yeah.
Yeah, and he described Poe as divided between two obsessive tendencies in his writings, the visionary and the logical,
Hmm.
which that's right up what Valerie loved most about him, his
Absolutely.
logical and his vision.
Yeah, and one thing about Valerie, I still want to say Valerie, and I'm
Uh-huh.
saying sorry. He basically was a law student. I mean, he graduated from college and then he went on to law. And so he's coming at this from a different perspective than I think people that traditionally just go right into writing, either prose, poetry, anything like that. But he wrote in kind of the vein of Stephen Mallarmé.
Hmm.
And Mallarmé and Pierre Lewis helped Valery get his work published. And Mallarmé was also a follower of Poe, as along with Baudelaire, which we've already done an episode back in, was it second season, third season?
I believe it was the second season.
Yeah. So they
I don't know
all
by now. What season are we in now? Okay.
four.
Oh, okay. So see, I don't remember. I think it was the
Yeah.
second.
And so, and the thing is, they all had a fondness of, like a deep fondness for Poe, loved his work. Baudelaire and Mallarmé celebrated Poe, but Valerie, to me, it was a whole nother level. It truly was like an obsession.
Yeah, and as you were talking about, Baudelaire and Mallarmé celebrated his visionary type of
Yes,
writing. They
yes,
were all about how, mind-blowing
yeah.
his artistic was, where Valerie was the total opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to his logical way of thinking. I mean, if he
Yeah,
went to law school, but a lot of people don't realize that lawyers, well, I know in today's law schools, they have to take storytelling
yeah,
because
I
when
would
you
think
are a
so.
lawyer, you have to tell a story
Yeah,
because you're presenting it from beginning to end.
exactly. Yeah,
And but I mean, there was nothing wrong with either side of that, whether it be the vision or the logical. But Valerie, yes, I think he truly felt more of a kinship and more of an obsessive type fanatical. He was
yeah,
definitely fanatical about Poe for good reason
yeah,
because he fit what Valerie thought in himself.
yeah, absolutely.
And it's kind of ironic that, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a medical doctor, went to medical school and everything, and then became a writer.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to me that he went to law school and then he became a writer.
Absolutely. And some of the things that Valerie loved the most about Poe was his essays about composition, the poetic principle, and
Hmm.
also his scientific work, Eureka, and how Valerie really tied into that, especially with the logical element, because in Eureka, all of the power of reason, just the reason, the rationality, and then also he loved the Dupin character, and just because ratiocination, and you
Hmm.
got that logician. Is that what we were trying to say earlier?
That's
Logician.
it. Logician.
I have it written down, so when I read it, yeah. Yes.
It's
So
much easier to when you're reading it than when
yeah,
you're trying to,
because
bring it out of your brain.
right. And so because Dupin was a logician, he was an armed
Hmm.
detective. And so I can see where that character, those three stories would definitely resonate with him more than some of Poe's short stories.
Yeah, that's because it went along with Valerie's. unyielding positivism, which
Yeah.
otherwise is rationalism,
Right.
that set him apart from all the other French authors.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote a letter to Andre Gide
Mm-hmm.
that said Poe, and I shouldn't talk about it, for I promised myself I wouldn't, is the only writer with no sins. Never was he mistaken, not led instinctively, but lucidly and successfully he made a synthesis of all the vertigos.
Interesting.
Yes, and so I thought that was rather telling that he
Huh.
thought that even though, I mean, think about it. What was the dude that didn't like Poe was always criticizing Griswold?
Oh yeah,
Couldn't think
Griswold.
of it.
I
I
thought
was
that's
like,
who you were.
gee,
I thought
yeah,
that's who we were referring to, but I was like, well, I mean, there are a few, and but
yeah,
he's
but
the main guy.
Griswold was his
Yeah.
biggest antithesis, yes.
Yes.
And so, but to hear that Valery thought that he was a writer with no sins,
Mm-hmm.
that he felt that much about how Poe was received to him because he saw his full potential. He saw the synthesis of all the vertigos, all
Mm-hmm.
the different directions.
Right.
And vertigo to me, major surrealism,
Absolutely.
because vertigo is where you're like seeing different things, more than one at all
Mhm.
times.
Yeah, and
So,
when I think of that word, of course I draw to Hitchcock, but I don't
mhm,
draw to necessarily the movie Vertigo, even though there are huge surrealistic moments in that movie. But I
mhm,
also think of Salvador Dali's,
of course,
in Spellbound,
time.
the
Yeah.
the scene that he paired up with Hitchcock to do. But yeah, it's very interesting take pulling in some Hitchcock here with some of the things that with surrealism. And you a lot of times you don't think of Hitchcock as surreal, but it fits.
Yeah, I mean, anybody that doesn't think Hitchcock is surreal, I might be a little suspicious of them. Because some of the things, like the birds and some of those, I'm talking, it can be possibilities, but it fits the surreal for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this was a very fascinating man to research. And as much as he loved Poe, it some of the things that he did and what he wrote and things like that, because he is a French poet, it he just seemed like he was angry and not a happy man. Did you get that
Yeah,
feeling when you were researching?
I did, but I also got the feeling that he was more upset with the life around him,
Hmm.
not so much his life.
Yeah. That and maybe, yeah, maybe so.
Because he had a very pendulum type of ideas.
Hmm.
He said that he had the scorn for the mystical, but at the same time, it's like he definitely loved the logical.
Hmm.
But he had an obsessive contempt for the 17th century mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal.
Right. Yes.
And he projected a visionary aspect, usually recognized in Poe, onto Pascal while making Rene Descartes, Pascal's contemporary, a figure of what he admired in Poe. So it's really
Yes.
kind of unusual that he would not see Pascal as more of the logical
Hmm.
and Descartes more of the mystical.
I agree. Yeah. And I
So
thought
I'm
that was a little bit odd, but then to tie into that as well, he wasn't a fan of Freud because
mhm,
psychology was being very prominent during this time. He didn't like
mhm.
psychology. He didn't like Freud. And the thing he did not like about psychology was the interpretation of it, of someone's mind. And I think it's because that aspect, it is essentially surrealistic, but it also is pulling out that abstract. And to me, Valery was more of a concrete person. Like if you think about art.
Yes, and the thing about it, I think that Valerie was really obsessive about was he loved the two. If you think about it from the brain point of view, we
Yeah,
have the right brain, we have the left brain, we have the logical and the art.
right.
And to me, Valerie was always at odds with because the two were competing.
Yes.
He was trying to find a balance and he had I'd say a fear, which would, you know,
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge some of his rather anger that he may have projected in some of his, biographies and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
that he couldn't distinguish between the science, the metaphysics, the rational, the mysticism,
Mm-hmm.
that it would not hold up in his own musings,
Yeah,
that he would have the difficulty of making it clear. I
right.
mean, but he, as a writer, they all have the same problem. And I think that's one of the things why he was so obsessed with Poe, because Poe seemed to have a nice balance that held up.
Absolutely. And he also was and I don't want to say obsessed. That's too strong a word for what I'm about to say, but he had a flair towards intellect, the
Mm-hmm.
intellectual mind and what it had to offer and what it was capable of.
Yeah. Eh, the intellectual self,
Hmm.
I think is what they had,
Yeah,
identified it at. The Narcissus myth is well documented.
yeah, and
Because one of his earlier poems on the subject, The Narcissus Speaks,
yeah,
um, which, if we don't, for people that may not know the story of Narcissus, that he was so obsessed with himself because he had to look at himself in the water because he was
right.
obsessed with his beauty that he eventually died because he just forgot about the rest of the world.
Exactly. And there is a narcissus flower that is kind of hooked to the myth. And
Yep.
what's so ironic is that the flower, it's part of the lily family, and it is
Mm-hmm.
absolutely beautiful. You might have heard of paper white narcissus, and
Mm-hmm.
they smell so bad.
Oh yes, they do. They may look beautiful, but oh boy, they're not like a rose.
No.
They don't have thorns, but they've got a smell
Oh,
that
it's awful.
ugh.
Yeah, it
It's like the
smells.
corpse flower. It's
Yeah,
not as bad as the corpse flower, but it's
right.
bad.
Yeah. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah. So, but Narcissus Speaks, his earlier poem is one that if you haven't gone and read it, you need to go read it because it shows a side to Valerie's ideals
Yeah.
and anti-philosophy, which is kind of ironic.
Hmm.
Um, so it's kind of cool.
And I'm trying to, because I did read several of his poems. How long was that one? Do you have it pulled up?
Nope, but I can.
I was going to say, would you like to read it? I thought it would be kind of nice if we did read one of his poems.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull it up here really quick.
Right.
Oh, please don't give it to me in French. I don't think I'll be able to read it to you
No,
in
and while
French.
you're looking, so that particular poem was recognized and very favorable among some of the literary establishments during his time. And so it was published in an anthology called Poets of Today. And
Mm-hmm.
so that was kind of, again, Jeannie said it was one of his earlier poems that he wrote. And so when he started being published, it was around, I think it was 1888. Was that right, Jeannie? Does that
I
sound?
believe so,
Yeah.
yes.
And so,
Let me go
did you
ahead.
get
Well, I'm trying to find the actual. There's so many, Narcissus Speaks that other people have titled their poem.
okay?
So I'm trying to find the actual.
His poem.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and some other things that he did, he actually did had some other jobs besides just being a poet because
Mm-hmm.
his poetry career, I guess if you will, was a very short-lived time frame. And we'll talk about that after Jeannie reads the poem. But he worked in the French War Office during 1892 and he worked there until 1922. And so at that point, he had a spiritual crisis, and
Mm-hmm.
it caused him to have a 20-year hiatus from poetry, which I
That's
thought
just sad.
I know I was just shocked by that. And so it makes me wonder during that time frame, did he give up all poetry? Because that's what I felt like it meant. But as much as he loved Poe, did he give up Poe too? Or did he just give up the poetry of Poe? It's just something interesting to think about.
Yeah, I'm trying to see the date because this comes out from the collection, the collected poetry of Valery.
Yeah.
And it looks like it was published or collected poetry from 1966 to 2023. So
Mhm. Yeah,
they're
because
all collections. So,
yeah, because he the dates that I found was around 1888 to
Mhm.
1891, where he was writing poetry a lot. Like
Right.
that was his major years that he
Mhm.
wrote.
Okay, so I found it. It's
All right.
Narcissus Speaks. I'm not going to attempt the French version. Oh, brothers, sad lilies, I languish with beauty, for desiring myself in your fair nudity, and towards you, nymph, nymph, O nymph of the fountains, I come to offer pure silence my vain tears. A great calm attends me, where I listen for hope. The water's voice changes and speaks of the evening. I hear silver grass grow in the holy shadow, and the deceitful moon elevates her mirror even to the secrets of the dried up fountain. And me, having plunged wholeheartedly in the reeds, I languish, O sapphire, for my sad beauty. I know no more love for magical waters where I forget the laughter and the ancient rose. How I lament your fatal and pure splendor, O fountain so languidly by me surrounded, where my eyes have drawn up from immortal azure my image with a wreath of humid flowers crowned. Alas, the image is vain and the tears eternal. Over the bluish woods with their brotherly arms, an ambiguous hour's tender glow exists, and the last of the day forms for me a bridegroom, nude on the pale place where the sad water lures, delicious demon, desirable and icy. Here in the water my flesh is moonlight and dew. O form obedient and opposite my eyes. Here are my silver arms with their pure gestures, my lingering hands and lovely grow cold, lovely gold grow weary of calling this captive whom the leaves interlace, and I cry to the echoes the names of dark gods. Farewell, reflection lost on the calm enclosed wave. Narcissus, the very name, a tender perfume for the soft heart. Scatter for the shades of the dead the funerary rose upon this empty tomb. Be then my lip, the rose distributing the kiss, which makes a dear spectre gradually appeased. For the night speaks softly, nearby and far away, two calyxes full of shade and of light slumbers, but the moon is at play with recumbent myrtles. I adore you under these myrtles, O doubtful flesh sorrowfully budding for the solitude, and mirrored by the mirror sleeping in the wood. I free myself in vain from your gentle presence. The false hour slackens our members on the moss, and with a sombre delight swells the profound wind. Farewell, Narcissus, die! The twilight has arrived. At the sigh of my heart, my appearance trembles. The flute, buried deep in the azure, modulates regretfully for sonorous flocks departing. But on the mortal cold wherein the star is lit, before a slow tomb is formed of nothing but mist, take this kiss which breaks the calm of fatal water. Hope alone may suffice to shatter this crystal. The ripple ravishes me from my exile's breath, so that my breath can animate a slender flute, whose nimble player may be to me indulgent. Fade, vanishing away, perturbed divinity, and you pour out to the moon, humble, lonely flute, the whole diversity of our tears of silver. And that is Narcissus Speaks. Yay! Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, and you know what's interesting? Well, there was one line, the alliteration was just like, oh, perfection.
Oh yeah.
It's the delicious demon, desirable, that one line. I was like, oh, and then something that you just, one of the other lines toward the end, it said something about take this kiss or something of that. So that, guess what that reminded me of, which is very surrealistic from Poe.
Mm-hmm.
Take this kiss upon the brow and in parting from you now.
Yes, because his was take this kiss which breaks the calm of fatal water.
Yes, and which makes sense with Narcissus.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just thought that was very Poe-esque to have that
Yes,
line in there. Very nice.
yes, it was in the
Yeah, that was a
alliteration
beautiful
with
poem.
delicious demon, desirable and icy.
Yes, that's a great line. And then
Mhm.
I almost actually started a little bit of a laugh. I was trying not to when you said, oh, Narcissus or something, die.
Yeah, that was very, it was like, okie dokie. It
Yes.
says, farewell, Narcissus,
Yes.
die.
Yes. But no,
That's pretty like,
that was
okay.
a beautiful poem. I
Mhm.
do find it somewhat poesque.
Yeah,
And
it was one of the ones that spoke to me a lot, like with Poe's,
yeah,
a mixture of his with the beauty and the darkness.
yes, absolutely. And I
And
think it
then
was, yeah, very
the love,
fitting.
his love dying. I
Yeah,
mean, it's the
abs
equivalent of love dying.
got the death of a beautiful woman.
hmm And I like this one because he leaves it vague
Mhm.
enough to where you don't know if the speaker is the woman or if narcissist could be a man or a woman.
That's true.
You know, I
Yeah.
mean, I had a great grandmother. Her name was Narcissi.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and everybody called her Narcissus.
Okay. That's interesting.
So yeah, so man, woman, it didn't matter, and that's one of the things with this poem that I thought was very interesting, that it had an interchangeable. You know how Poe's with the narrator could be anything. You've seen how many like Poe movies they've taken the Telltale Heart and made the narrator the female.
Absolutely, which is, I think, brilliant.
So I think that's where he shows his poesqueness.
I think so too. Yeah, he was very talented, and
hmm
with his view on it's more about the words than the content. To me, the content wasn't lacking here, taken
hmm
from the Greek myth, but his words were stronger than the content if you really dig deep into it. It's the both of them are
Yes.
there, but his words, what he believed in, it shined through very strong.
Yes, his alliteration and his word build
Mhm.
build the poetry.
Yeah,
It's not the story. It was the words that gave it
exactly.
the story.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So the last thing that he wrote was actually never finished, and it was more of a dramatic work called My Faust, and it was two parts put together. I think one was called Lust and one was called Testy, the characters that he created,
Hmm.
I believe. And this was towards the end of his life, and they people found, or I should say, scholars found, that he had
Hmm.
over 250 notebooks full of essays, I think some other works, and it is now
Yep.
published. And I thought that was really interesting that in a way he kind of hoarded those
Well, I mean, he went on a 20-year, he renounced
hiatus. Yeah.
poetry for 20 years
Yeah.
in 1892,
Hmm.
uh, because his first love had something to do with his intellectual and spiritual crisis of 1892.
Right. Right.
Because he had finished his law degree and he had published Narcissus Speaks, and it was celebrated by the Paris literary establishments,
Right.
and everything. And it suddenly something happened. He took on a crisis,
Hmm.
very poetic in his real life. 20
Exactly.
years he renounced poetry, and then they found all these notebooks, and all of a sudden, and they the play, you know,
Yeah.
he was also wrote the play called Lust.
Yeah.
I believe that was the name of it.
Yeah,
Yes.
it was part of my Faust. It wasn't complete,
Yes.
and
Yeah,
it
it was the
of
part
it.
of
Yeah,
My Faust, the unfinished play Lust,
yeah,
testimony of his longing for a perfect communion he never found.
yeah. And it did seem like it's very interesting to think about what he liked about writing was the word
Hmm.
intellectual self. He did not like interpretations of psychology, and he was looking for a perfect society. He was it seems to me he was extreme perfectionist. And it
Yep.
nothing was probably ever good enough in his mind.
Well,
Possibly.
I mean,
If you read between the lines.
well, and it falls into an artistic mentality, in my opinion,
Yes, absolutely.
because as artists, you are your own worst critic.
Yes. Yes.
And even people telling you how wonderful it is, or how great it may be, or how horrible it is, or it is the worst thing ever, you take all of that criticism, good and bad,
Yep.
and it has to affect you. And then if you already are on that precipice where you can't balance what you feel
Yeah.
between the metaphysical and the logical,
Hmm.
you're setting yourself up for a crisis in its own self, you know.
Absolutely. And that's what sounds like what happened to him. And
Hmm.
then later on, he married a friend of Mallarmé's daughter. And I thought
Right.
it was very fitting. Her name was Jeanie, but it has two N's.
Yes, which way
Gobillard.
everybody spells my name.
Gobillard. So was her
Yeah.
name.
Hey, gotta love the genies.
Yeah. So I guess he was dreaming of Jeanie.
Exactly. In the early days before anybody else. It's kind of ironic their name was not Janine.
Yeah, I really thought it was going to be Jean or Janae or something like that.
Yes. But hey, you can't pass up the J, even if they
Yep.
did put two ends, but
So around 1912, he actually did kind of come out of that state of,
well,
yes,
mhm.
and he began revising some of his work to help him get out of his poetry slump.
Yes. And he actually was 1937, he was appointed to the as the new chair in poetry at the College de France, position he held until his death in 1945.
Yeah, which I thought was really nice that even though he took that time away from poetry, he got back to it, and I'm sure
Mhm.
he made a difference at the college.
Oh yeah, I mean, especially with his differing points of view,
Mm-hmm.
him being able to see two sides and not having such a what did he call the very beginning? What did he call Mallarmé's and others with their poetry? The cult,
Yes, it was.
so he was able to not follow the cult. So
Yeah,
I'd say he gave a very round idea of poetry to his students, which would be wonderful. Um, and it is wonderful that he was able to come out of that funk, that self-exile
yeah.
after 20 years and then hold a
Ah,
position of that.
esteem. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well,
Thank you. I
and
was looking at
it
the word.
it kind of, and this is just something that popped in my head. Because he was so obsessed with Poe, it makes me think of when you said cult, the show The
Hmm.
Following with Kevin Bacon and the professor. I can't remember what the professor's name was, the character, but he was obsessed with Poe and he had a cult and
Hmm.
he was a serial killer and all of that, and that kind of makes me think of Valery, and to think he was kind of a cult of one for Poe in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, he had his own form of a cult, and I think he came, the word fanatical
Hmm.
is, fans comes
Yeah,
from the word fanatical,
absolutely.
which is very cultish in my opinion, because I
Ah,
mean, come on.
oh yeah,
Some of the fans can be very obsessive and very creepy. So,
absolutely. And just I also want to just shout out right here because we may have mentioned this before, but it's like when you take Poe, Kevin
mhm.
Bacon, and the following, the 6 degrees of Poe and Bacon come together. So,
Yeah,
Kevin Bacon, or someone that knows Kevin Bacon, if you're listening, we invite you on to the 6 degrees of Poe.
yes, we would love to have another connection, another degree.
Yes, where it all comes together.
Exactly. We want to come full circle.
Absolutely. But we're gonna keep circling though through
Exactly. We'll
our
keep doing
degree.
the circling, because, well, as you know, just because the degrees keep connecting, there are so many connections.
Oh my
It's like,
gosh.
it's like the universe. It's not it's not a straight line.
Right.
It has its spirals and
Mm-hmm.
it's
Circles.
infinity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So it's four-dimensional.
Yes.
But Valerie died, I thought
Mhm.
it was ironic, on July the 20th, 1945, at the close of France's last 20th century war with Germany.
I thought that was very interesting as well.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was born at the conclusion of its last 19th century one.
Hmm.
And then he died at the end of the 20th century war,
Yeah.
because Germany and France always had problems.
Oh, yeah.
But he was
Well, and
given a state funeral, which is really cool, in
yeah,
Paris, and buried at the cemetery of Cité, his birthplace and the setting for the seaside cemetery.
yes. And I thought that was really neat. I did read that one, and that was really good. Uh,
Hmm.
and when you think about it, thinking about Germany and France, just thinking about the elements of people, culture, things like that, they really kind of are like the right side and left side of your brain.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, the
it kind of makes
logical
sense. Yeah.
versus
Just
the artistic.
the fighting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the French have always been so open with any arts,
Mm-hmm.
and cooking, love, romance.
Mm-hmm.
French is one of the Latin romantic
Right.
languages.
Yeah.
And then you got German with its very standard, logical, hammer down.
Hmm.
Not that they don't have their own type of artistics, but it's very
Absolutely.
architectural.
Yes.
Because the German the German artists were very structured classical artists.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
They had their own architectural schools where
Mm-hmm.
everything was very standard, stationary.
Yeah.
They're beautiful, but they are definitely minimalists.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, one other thing I wanted to add too is that
Mhm.
in 1924, his collection of his essays was published, and this contains his article that he wrote on Poe's Eureka because he was very fascinated by it.
Yes, which is great because, everybody is fascinated at one point or another
Hmm.
with the Poe. So
Absolutely.
it's good that they included his fascination.
Yeah, and his first readings of Poe actually came from Baudelaire's translations from
Hmm.
English into French. And he wrote essays on, again, Poe's Eureka, but he really liked the philosophy of composition that Poe wrote, so he wrote about that. He also took and he wrote an essay about Leonardo da Vinci, and he looked at Poe's method of the creative mind in it and what it was attempting to do and how successful it became or like
Hmm.
created something. So I thought that was really interesting. So
Yeah.
he had some very interesting things he wrote about. Again, some were Poe-esque and then some were not so Poe-esque, but I think using Poe's methods as much as he could.
Yeah, and that's one of the things because Poe was both the logical and the visionary.
Hmm.
So he was able to use both sides of Poe in his works. So,
Yes. And the character that he created, Edmund Testy, which I think was linked to the My Faust, was based all on C. Auguste Dupin.
of course, you got to love Dupin, who was the French, could have been the French Valery. So
Yeah,
you never know.
absolutely. Absolutely. And so
So it,
to kind of,
go ahead.
I was going to say, just to really sum it up, he really felt like the scientific analysis had to be involved in creative achievements. That just all of that, you can't have one without the other.
Yeah, and it goes along with the early 19th century Enlightenment period.
Hmm.
That's where science and religion came together,
Yeah.
and reform and all that started happening with the Second Great Awakening. So by the late 19th century, when he was, live and living,
Hmm.
it very much made a big impact, in my opinion, that those were still alive and well, but they were continuing to, what's the word? Matriculate. They were tending to
Hmm.
adapt to,
Yeah.
you know, make,
Evolve. Yeah.
yeah, evolve. Thank you.
Mhm.
I couldn't come up with a word. It was just like right there. And so, and I see it even today. I mean, anything that we see on television,
Hmm.
the science is behind it, and also the just romanticism, the vision
Yeah.
of what it could be.
Hmm.
And a lot of things that used to be, fantastical have actually become reality.
Yeah, that's very true. But I will say, and some people probably will not like what I'm about to say,
Mhm.
but thinking about the logical, the scientific overshadowing creativity, I truly believe that is happening with CGI. It's too
Mhm.
easy now for movies to be created. And not saying that doing it is easy. I mean, that is a talent that people have that is beyond measure. I mean, it's amazing what people can do, but I love going back to old movies, even back to our silent films that we were watching at the beginning of
Yep.
Review Morgue. And I like that element of creating something that you think is impossible, but making it
Mhm.
show up on film without digital assistance.
Yeah. Because that was back when they were just trying to figure out what digital was
Mm-hmm.
with the
Yeah.
video and the, audio and all that kind of stuff. And they were creating these masterpieces that, in my opinion, still can't hold up to some of what is in today's society.
Yeah.
Because, like you said, CGI, I agree to some extent. I mean, I'm a diehard computer junkie.
Yeah.
I'll admit that. But I also don't view it as the end all be all.
Yeah.
I see it as just a tool to be
Yeah. Right.
used.
Right.
But you still have to have that vision. You still have to have that creativity
Yes.
because the thing that I always go back to that tells me the logic meeting the vision is Star Wars.
Yeah.
I mean, just to think that they put, and I mean, you can go even farther back than that to Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
Even
Absolutely.
though it was very rudimentary,
Mm-hmm.
but they didn't
Very
have a
well
lot to
done
work
for the time. Mm-hmm.
exactly, but they could create things that were realistic in their own way, even
Right.
though they were
Right.
fantastical.
Mm-hmm.
They made them logical. So I agree with Valerie on that. You have to have the logical, but you have to have the vision,
Yeah.
and you can't have one without the other.
Yeah. They go hand in hand.
Exactly.
And the
And that's Poe
one thing I forgot,
along.
oh yeah, one thing I forgot to mention was that even though Valerie did criticize Poe's Eureka, and I
Hmm.
think there were several people that criticized it, but he did say it had so much merit to it. He basically said that some of the things that Poe wrote about were very forward thinking for the time. And this is what launched Valery into his interest in science. And so
Hmm.
it's Poe to thank for that. So not just Poe's writing poetry and the detective, but it's also that science element as well. And so he, I mean, really of everybody we've talked about so far, he's really Poe's number one fan from back in the day.
Yes, but you could argue that it could be Jules Verne because
True.
he was the first one to kind of write the first
Fanfic.
fanfic
Yeah, very
based
true.
on one of Poe's stories.
Yes.
So
True. They're both up there.
I would have to agree that Jules Verne is up there, but if I had to put them side by side, Valerie would definitely have increased above Jules Verne just because not writing a fanfic, just because he had such a more obsessive way of thinking about Poe.
Oh, absolutely. And just to kind of show more of his obsession, I'll read two more quotes from him. He says, "For extraordinary reading, I've had Poe's love letters. Something that you understand is dizzying for me, but we shall talk about it again." So obviously, he was enthralled with reading some of Poe's works if
Mhm.
it's dizzying. And then
Yeah.
this other quote is, "But 3 or 4 sentences of Edgar Poe gave me the capital sensation that awakened the creature of desire, the demon that possessed me."
Nah. Yes.
So I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I can actually identify with that quote because
Mm,
sometimes when I read certain poets, it feels like I'm possessed by a demon. But
yeah.
I mean, I just gotta say that,
Oh, well, just
especially when I read some
Annabelle Lee where
words
they're
with a
hanging
none in.
out.
Yeah.
They're, go to Annabelle Lee where they're hanging out under the sea.
Hmm. Yeah. They're mermen, so,
Yes,
or they're drowning themselves. Who knows?
that's true. We'll never
Never
know.
know. We'll never know.
Oh, well, Jeanie, do
Yes.
you have anything else to add about Mr. Valery? I'm having a hard time trying to say his name.
Yes, Mr. Paul Valery. No, I don't have anything else to add. I think we've thoroughly covered his obsession with Poe and his love of Poe,
Mm-hmm.
and how that logic and vision can be very well together.
Absolutely. A
Hmm.
balance of just intellectual symmetry.
Exactly. That's a good way of saying it.
All right. Well, I
And
guess on that note,
note, we
we
are
are
Poe.
out.
It is not improbable that a few farther steps in phrenological science will lead to a belief in the existence, if not the actual discovery and location, of an organ of analysis.